Hi, everybody. This is Sean Turner, and welcome to the next edition of the Cose WebEd series webinar. We have a very good topic on deck for you today. It's cybersecurity, some recent FTC cases and guidance on data security and data breach. We have a great guest with us today, Amy Hocevar from the Federal Trade Commission. Let me go ahead and introduce Amy. Amy Hocevar is an attorney with the Federal Trade Commission's regional office in Cleveland. She focuses on helping to fulfill the agency's consumer protection mission by bringing civil law enforcement actions in federal court against companies engaged in unfair or deceptive trade practices and by educating consumers through community outreach. Prior to joining the FTC, Amy spent 10 years in private practice as a litigator, handling cases involving fraud, deceptive advertising, and Ponzi schemes. She also clerked for the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit and the Supreme Court of Ohio. So, with all that said, I am going to turn things over to Amy now, and we'll get things started. Go ahead, Amy.
Hi, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Cose, for having me. Today I'm going to talk about some of the lessons learned from cases that the FTC has brought and how you can use these cases to keep up to date on data security issues in order to protect your business. And a bit of housekeeping, I do have to let you know that these views expressed in here today are my own and not necessarily those of the FTC officially or any other person. And so if you're not familiar with the FTC, most people know them for the tags that are on mattresses that people are always worried about whether they can tear them off or not. But the Federal Trade Commission has actually been around for over 100 years. President Woodrow Wilson, pictured here, signed the Federal Trade Commission Act into law back in 1914. And the original aim of the agency was more of an anti-monopoly trust busting. But since then, it is really changed into several different things. We still have the Bureau of Competition, and that is the bureau that helps promote competition among companies so that you have more choice in who you buy products from. But I'm in the Bureau of Consumer Protection, and that makes sure that consumers have accurate information. And so those things working together, if you have accurate information and you have competition, then you'll get better products, low prices, and hopefully more innovation and a better economy. So how does the FTC work to ensure that people have accurate information? Well, the FTC Act has a provision that prohibits companies from engaging in unfair or deceptive ads or practices. And so how does this equate to the data security privacy context? Well, first of all, you can't be deceptive. Your company must honor its promises. And so if you promise to keep something confidential, if you promise not to disclose your customers' information, if you promise to only collect certain data, then you have to live up to those promises. But there's also something called unfairness, and that gets a little trickier. And so even without a specific promise, a company may not do certain things. And so you kind of look at what a consumer expects. You can't use data in egregious ways and collect information in egregious ways. And you must meet consumer expectations with respect to privacy of their information. And your data security must be reasonable in light of the risks posed by a breach. In addition to the FTC Act, there are also several other statutes and rules the FTC looks to in terms of data security and privacy. There's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which is focusing on children's privacy, Fair Credit Reporting Act, and the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, and the GLBA Safeguards rules that both deal with kind of financial institutions, banks or non-bank financial institutions. So we can see that the FTC has the authority, but what really is the FTC's role in data security? Well, the Washington Post has remarked that the FTC was built 100 years ago to fight monopolists, and now it's Washington's most powerful technology cop. So the FTC is really taking an active role in this space, and the FTC takes its role seriously. Here are some of the companies represented that the FTC has sued for data security or privacy-related issues. And I certainly don't want to scare you today about, the FTC bringing action, but what I want to point out is that some of these companies, many of them you've heard of, and they're large companies. And so they have not done things right, but you can take guidance from what they have done incorrectly in order to protect your small business from being subject to hacking or misplaced trust of your consumers if their data gets misused. So the FTC has brought, as you can see, hundreds of cases: spam, spyware, privacy, and data security cases. And in looking to the FTC's enforcement, there are really 4 points that guide what the FTC does. The first is information security is an ongoing process. It's not something you can do once and just forget about. A company's security process must be reasonable and appropriate in light of the circumstances. And I often get asked, I'm a small company. Am I held to the same standard as some of the largest companies in the country? And so the advice that's given is that a security process must be reasonable in light of the volume and sensitivity of the information the company holds, the size and complexity of the company's operations, the cost of the tools that are available to address vulnerabilities, and other factors. So while the FTC and others may look to a size and complexity of a company, it also depends on the volume and sensitivity of the information that your company holds. For instance, health information is held to a very high standard as consumers really want that information to be protected. Another point that guides the FTC's enforcement is that a breach does not necessarily show a failure to have reasonable security measures. There is no thing as perfect security. So just because there's a breach doesn't mean that a company has done something wrong. And the same thing, just because you haven't had a breach doesn't mean that your practices are not subject to FTC enforcement. They may be unreasonable. So the first line of cases I'd like to talk about are the accuracy of a company's representation. Then we'll move to discussing cases where data is at risk of being hacked. And so the first case I'd like to talk about is one involving the Brightest Flashlight app. And this is an app that was downloaded by tens of millions of consumers. It was a popular Android app, and this was before iPhones had flashlights built into them. And so the app made you agree when you downloaded it that the app could use your personal information to provide software updates, product support, and other services. But in reality, the app would transmit your precise location and your unique telephone identifier to third parties, including advertisers. So, for instance, if you use the app when you're on vacation, you may start seeing ads for locales close to you because it was transmitting this information to advertisers. The app also says, if you click refuse, if you refuse to accept the terms after you've downloaded it and it shows you the terms and conditions, that the app wouldn't collect your device and user information. And of course, if you click refuse, you think that it's not going to use your information. But in reality, as soon as the user opened the app for the first time, it started collecting and sharing information with third parties. And so this is a case that just highlights that if you're going to make promises, your company has to live up to them. In terms of data hacking and making sure that your consumer information is protected, the FTC has come up with a publication called Start with Security. And from the hundreds of cases, it is distilled down to 10 lessons that we're going to talk about. The first lesson is to start with security. And that means that security should be factored into every decision in every department of your business: personnel, sales, accounting, information technology. So you should not collect and keep information just because or because you're too busy to figure out whether you need it or whether to get rid of it. That's no longer an acceptable business strategy. So underneath the Start with Security, the first piece of advice is don't collect personal information that you don't need. One case that the FTC brought is against a company that was called RockU. And it was an online social gaming site, and it allowed consumers to play games and do other things. But in order to access all of the features, consumers had to provide their email addresses and email passwords. So this may seem ridiculous today, but back a few years ago, people would routinely give their email addresses and email passwords. And so not specific to this device, but your actual password. And so the hackers were able to access the personal information of 32 million users. And so the FTC said that this company created an unnecessary risk to people's email accounts because they did not need to collect that sensitive information. And I'll tell you from a personal experience, I registered my children online for school recently, and the online registration asked for my personal health history. And I didn't provide it, but my thought was, why in the world are they asking for this information? Is that something that they need, and is it something that they really, it's a big risk to be asking for? Another piece of advice under Start with Security is to hold on to information only as long as you have a legitimate business need for it. So BJ's Wholesale Club, they collected customers' credit and debit card information in order to process transactions. So collecting it wasn't a problem. They had a legitimate business need for that. But according to the FTC's complaint, it stored the information for up to 30 days, long after the sale was complete. So holding on to that information without a legitimate business need created an unreasonable risk to consumers. And so hackers stole the account data and used it to make counterfeit credit and debit cards, resulting in $13 million in fraudulent credit and debit credit card purchases, is what the FTC alleged. And so BJ's Wholesale Club could have limited its risk by securely disposing of the information once it no longer had a need for it. Another piece of advice is to not use personal information when it's not necessary. So a company that the FTC alleged called Accretive Health, they used real people's personal information in employee training sessions. And then they failed to remove the information from the employees' computers after the sessions were over. So imagine a case where you have given a company your personal health information, and you learn that it's widely disseminated to employees within that company, and then they're just sitting on their computers. That's not an expectation that consumers would have. And similarly, in Foro International, the FTC charged that the company gave access to sensitive consumer data to their service provider who was developing applications for the company. So obviously the service provider needed to have the types of data in order to develop the application, but Foro could have used anonymized data or made-up data instead of providing the actual data. Fictitious information would have been a better choice in both of these cases. The next tip, number 2, is to control access to data sensibly. So the FTC actually issued a closing letter to Morgan Stanley. So that is the closing letters where they looked into a breach and decided not to pursue it. And so Morgan Stanley did a lot of things right. So they only allowed employees to access personal data for which they had a business need. They monitored the size and frequency of data transfer by employees. They prohibited employees from using USB or other devices, and they blocked employee access to certain high-risk web applications and websites. But in this case, an employee gained access to reports where the security settings were configured incorrectly, and their set of reports that this employee was able to access transferred to a personal website at work and then onto personal devices later. So this is a situation where a breach occurred, but the FTC determined that that there was not enough to pursue it because the other indicia were that the protections were reasonable. Another piece of guidance is to limit administrative access. And so administrative access, if you don't know, allows a user to make system-wide changes to your system. And so that should be limited to only the employees tasked with that job. And so one case that the FTC brought was the FTC alleged that Twitter had granted almost all of its employees administrative control over Twitter's system, including the ability to reset passwords, view non-public tweets, send tweets on users' behalf. It also allowed access to the email addresses, IP addresses, and telephone numbers behind the account. And so hackers gained administrative control of Twitter on multiple occasions. And so companies should be careful to limit access to confidential information to employees with a legitimate business reason. The third tip is to require secure passwords and authentication. Store passwords securely. So in guidance software, the FTC alleged that guidance failed to protect information by storing in clear, readable text network administrator credentials such as username and password. And in the Reed case, the FTC alleged that customers could store their credentials in a vulnerable format in cookies on their computers. And so making sure that if there are good passwords, that there are prohibitions on storing them in non-safe ways is another way to protect access. And so again, in Twitter, the FTC said that Twitter failed to establish policies that prohibit employees from storing administrative passwords in plain text in their personal email accounts. So make sure as a company you have strong policies in place on your employees' protection of their passwords, and make sure to monitor that that is actually being followed by the employees. A third tip here is to guard against brute force attacks. And brute force attacks are really where a hacker tries endless attempts to get into someone's account. And most accounts now that I go to, I get 3 or 4 times before I'm locked out of my account. And so in the cases represented here, the FTC alleged that the businesses didn't suspend or disable accounts after a certain number of unsuccessful login attempts. And therefore, hackers could just repeatedly try to get in until they were able to access confidential information from these companies. This next tip is a little more technical. So protect against authentication bypass. So for the IT people on the phone, in a case that the FTC brought against Lookout Services Company, the people could get access to sensitive information not with typing in a username and password, but by predicting a relatively simple URL in a web browser. And this is called predictable resource location. And so you basically kind of foresee what the URL will be if it's something that, it makes sense too much, and then you could actually just type that in and bypass the login. And so as a result of this, an employee of one of Lookout's customers accessed the Social Security numbers of about 37,000 consumers. The fourth tip is to store sensitive personal information securely and protect it during transmission. And this means to keep it secure throughout its entire life cycle. So Superior Mortgage was a lender with 40 branches in 10 states. And of course, as a lender, it had Social Security numbers, credit histories, credit card numbers, and it used SSL encryption from the customer's web browser to the company's website server. But once the information reached the server, the service provider decrypted it and emailed it in clear, readable text to headquarters and to the branch offices. So the takeaway from this is to use strong cryptography to secure confidential material during storage and transmission through the whole cycle. Also, under storing personal information securely is to use industry-tested and accepted methods. Keep in mind that experts already may have developed effective standards that can apply to your business. And in ValueClick, the FTC alleged that it stored sensitive customer information in a database that used a non-standard proprietary form of encryption instead of tried and true industry-tested methods. And so this is basically a simple alphabetic substitution system of encryption that was subject to significant vulnerabilities. Actually, it was subject to many vulnerabilities that were commonly known and inexpensively able to protect against. And so the FTC brought an action against this company for that. Also, if you are using available software, make sure that it's properly configured. And so in both Fandango and Credit Karma, the secure sockets layer, SSL encryption, was disabled. And so those two companies disabled or overrode this default validation process. One company was in the testing process and failed to turn it back on. And they could have easily tested to make sure that this vulnerability wasn't in place. But make sure that you have good personnel implementing the products that you are using to make sure that you're getting what the products are supposed to do. Number 5 is to segment your network and monitor who's trying to get in and out. So in DSW, their data security failure allowed hackers to gain access to credit card, debit card, and checking account information of more than 1.4 million customers. So in addition to other failures that led to the hack, DSW failed to limit sufficiently the ability of computers on one in-store network to connect to computers on other in-store and corporate networks. And so DSW could have reduced this risk by sufficiently segmenting its network. So, does every branch need to be able to access all of the information back at headquarters and the information on every other branch? To make sure that it's segmented and only those who have access to and need to talk to each other do talk to each other. Number 5 also includes monitoring activity on your network. And so Dave & Buster's and Card Systems both did not use sufficient measures to detect unauthorized access to its network. And so in one of them, hackers exploited the weakness and installed programs on the network that collected and stored sensitive data and sent it outside the network every 4 days. And if there was some sort of monitoring of activity, the companies would have seen this information, large volumes of information going out on a regular basis and been able to stop it sooner.
One question that's come in, Amy, if we have some time, is how long should a company be looking to retain sensitive information on their systems? Is there a guideline? Is there a mile?
Yes. Well, it definitely depends on what type of information it is, because there are certain laws on how long you can and should keep, and there are laws on you can't keep it for a certain amount of time. For instance, in the BJ's Wholesale Club, there are bank laws on how long information should be retained. So first look to how long you have to keep it, if you have to, or you can't keep it past. And then think about whether you are actively using the information or you're just keeping it because you might need it in the future. How hard is it to get the information again later if you need it? So there isn't unfortunately, a tried and true time period, but I would look at when the last time is that you access the information, and also, how sensitive is it? Is it people's work email addresses, or is it someone's health information? That also should factor into how long a company keeps information. So the 6th tip is to secure remote access to your network. This is one of my favorite slides, and normally, being with the FTC, I wouldn't put someone's Social Security number out there, but this is the Social Security number of the CEO of LifeLock, and you may have heard of that company. It kind of protects your identity. And so the CEO advertised that the company could protect your identities, and he was so comfortable with this that he put his own Social Security number out there. And last I heard, his identity has been stolen at least 13 times. So the first FTC case involving this company charged that the company failed to install antivirus or anti-spyware programs on the computers that their employees used when working remotely. And they also failed to regularly record or monitor activity on the network. So don't just think about the computers that are in your company, but those that are being used by your employees to access the system. And so there was a $12 million settlement against LifeLock in 2010, and in 2016, the FTC alleged that LifeLock had not lived up to its promises in that settlement, which required the company to secure consumers' personal information and prohibited deceptive advertising. And then the FTC sought and received a $100 million contempt penalty against LifeLock. Also, put sensible limits in place. And so Dave & Buster's failed to adequately restrict third-party access to its network, according to the FTC. So an intruder connected to the network via the third-party access and intercepted personal information. So another big example of this is Target, and that hack and data breach occurred because of through a vendor. So make sure that those who are accessing your network or have access have appropriate protections in place. And so To reduce this risk, some advice that I've heard that I think is good advice is to restrict connections to your network to specified IP addresses, and so you know who's coming in. You can also think about whether you can block certain countries' IP addresses. If you're not doing any business with certain countries, then you can block all IP addresses from that country to your network. You can also grant temporary limited access to third parties, and so they don't just every time they need it, they can get into your system automatically. You know, they can give you a call, you can give access, and then you can take it away. So make sure to think about putting sensible limits in place. And also apply sound security practices when developing new products. If your product will be storing or sending sensitive information, is your product up to the task of handling the data securely? And this requires training your engineers in secure coding. For example, according to the complaint in a case called HTC America, the company failed to implement readily available secure communications mechanisms in the logging applications it pre-installed on its mobile devices. And as a result, malicious third-party apps could communicate with the logging applications, placing all sorts of sensitive text messages, location data at risk. And so the company could have reduced this risk by adequately training its engineers in secure coding practices. Follow platform guidelines for security. You know, when it comes to security, there may not be a need to reinvent the wheel. The platform, in the cases shown, explicitly warns against taking certain actions, like turning off SSL certificate validation. So when there's built-in warnings, follow those warnings, because sometimes the wisest course is to listen to the experts. The next case is the one that was on the news you may have heard of. This involves requiring that your privacy and security features work. So in TrendNet, they sold baby monitors, essentially, and so the FTC alleged the company failed to test that an option to make the camera feed private would in fact make it private, and as a result, hundreds of quote-unquote private camera feeds were publicly available. I'm sure you can imagine that that was very tragic for the people involved who were having their personal life displayed on the internet. Also, much to the chagrin of teenagers everywhere, Snapchat also had a problem in ensuring that its messages would disappear forever. So that was what they advertised, but instead the app saved video files to a location outside of the app sandbox, making it easy to recover video files with common browsing tools. So when you're offering these privacy and security features, make sure that your product lives up to your advertising claims. Also, test for common vulnerabilities. In a case of the FTC brought against Guess, the allegation was that the business failed to assess whether its web application was vulnerable to SQL injections. And so at that time, SQL injections were listed on the Open Web Application Security Project's top 10 vulnerabilities. So pay attention to what are common vulnerabilities and make sure that your business is protected against them. Also, make sure your service providers implement reasonable security measures. The company's not off the hook just because the data breach happens because of a third party. In a case against GMR transcription, the FTC alleged that the company hired a service provider to transcribe sensitive audio files containing health information, but that the company failed to require the service provider to take reasonable security measures to protect the information. As a result, the files were widely exposed on the internet. And so, for starters, the company could have included contract provisions that its service provider adopt reasonable security precautions. For instance, just even simple encryption could have been a requirement in the contract. And then also, once you have it in a contract, you have to verify that your service providers are complying. In a case that that the FTC brought against You Promise, the service provider was supposed to develop a browser toolbar that collected browsing information, but not certain personal information. It was supposed to be filtered out. And so in the data files that were sent from the service provider to UPromise, the personal information was there. UPromise didn't notice or do anything about it, and so the allegations were that UPromise didn't verify compliance with the service provider. A company should have procedures in place to keep security current and address vulnerabilities that may arise. In a case against the TJ Maxx companies that resulted in a hacker obtaining tens of millions of credit and debit card payment card information, the allegations that the FTC brought were that the company simply didn't update its antivirus software. So something as simple as that caused a major problem for the TJ Maxx companies. In a case against Fandango, a researcher actually contacted Fandango to let them know about a specific vulnerability in their security. And so they called the general number, and unfortunately, the system incorrectly categorized the report as a password reset request, sent an automated response, and marked the message as resolved, and it was not flagged for further review. Maybe this wasn't a phone call, maybe it was an email, but it was incorrectly marked as a password reset when they were on notice of a very big vulnerability. So as a result, Fandango didn't learn about the vulnerability until FTC staff contacted the company. So one lesson to take from this is to have an effective process in place to receive and address security vulnerability reports. So you may have a dedicated email address like security@ and then your company name.com that you put on your website, so that if anyone would see something, and there are people who do this, that they kind of just want to affirmatively help companies where they see problems, that they can let you know. And let's not forget about paper, thumb drives, and other devices. So, don't keep boxes with sensitive customer information in your garage. Don't leave faxed information that includes personal information, in the lunchroom. Make sure you treat it as you would other information that should be protected. Also, protect devices that process personal information, including, there's, of course, skimming devices that you need to make sure if you have devices out there in the community that those are being monitored as well. Keep safety standards in place when data is en route. So in a case that the FTC brought against Accretive Health, the FTC alleged that the employee left a laptop containing more than 600 files with 20 million pieces of unencrypted health information relating to 23,000 patients in the locked compartment of a car, which was then stolen. So, even where information is in a locked vehicle, it should be out of sight. It should be encrypted, and if it shouldn't be on the laptop to begin with, then it shouldn't be being carried around. Picture it as if you had a suitcase full of money. Would you leave that in your locked car? No, you would want to protect it, and hopefully you wouldn't just be carrying it around unless there was a reason that you had to carry it around. And finally, on these top 10 are to dispose of sensitive data securely. Companies like Rite Aid and Caremark are alleged to have tossed sensitive personal information like prescriptions into dumpsters. So make sure you think about what is being thrown in the garbage, wipe your hard drives before you sell them, and even think about photocopiers.
Amy, another question that's come in, if we have a minute, is on the topic of working with third parties. What's the best way to get them on board with your security processes? Is it just writing it into the contract, or how should that be handled?
Yeah, I think it's important for a company to make sure that its vendors, of course, comply with its security requirements, and not only putting it in the contract, but making sure that that your vendor knows that you are going to follow up and that it is important. It's not just boilerplate information that's put in there, that it's critical, and they're following that security protocol will depend on the relationship. Will be dependent. So if they don't do it, then you won't continue the relationship anymore. And so I think that that's a way to make sure that they are on board with protecting your information.
Great.
So these are kind of the top level information. So I did want to let you know how to get more details, especially for the technical people. So last year, the FTC held a series of roundtables throughout the country, including one right here in Cleveland in conjunction with Cose, to find out about the cybersecurity issues that small businesses are facing. And just maybe a week ago, we finally issued that, or not finally, it's only been a year since we had those, but we were able to issue very detailed guidance in conjunction with the Department of Homeland Security, NIST, and the SBA for small businesses. And so this is on 12 topics: cybersecurity basics, understanding the NIST cybersecurity framework, physical security, ransomware, phishing, business email imposters, tech support scams, vendor security, cyber insurance, email authentication, hiring a web host, and securing remote access. And I'll tell you, the three on the bottom are very technical, so they really give very great advice in that regard. There are videos and quizzes, there are employee training manuals, and I'm going to show you how to get that, but I really encourage you to review this information and distribute it to your employees, and you can even require them to take the quizzes and look at the videos. For instance, one of them is on cyber insurance, and it talks about what should your cyber insurance policy cover, and then it talks about consider whether your cyber insurance provider will cover these other things. So there are certain things that the FTC guidance is that a policy should cover, and then other things that you may want to cover, and you can look at when you're shopping for this. And so the next topic is what happens if a data breach occurs. And so even though I practice federal law, I did want to point out that there is a new data breach law effective in Ohio, November 1st, 2018. And it grants a defense in Ohio court if a data breach occurs and the businesses can prove that it has a cybersecurity program in place that meets industry-recognized frameworks. And there's a certain list of frameworks that are listed, including NIST, FedRAMP, SID critical security controls, ISO, IEC. So it gives really protocols for companies to look for this protection. And it applies to tort claims. So if there's an allegation that the company was negligent or there's an invasion of privacy. The FTC also has a publication that I'll instruct you on where to get on a data breach response so that you can have this. It's a guide for businesses. And it talks about how to secure your operations, fix vulnerabilities, and what parties need to be notified. The state and federal requirements, there's media requirements, police requirements. If you're under HIPAA, there are certain rules. There's also the FTC's health breach notification rule, which covers entities who are not covered by HIPAA but may still have health information, unencrypted health information that can reasonably be used to identify someone. And so there are certain requirements under this rule that affected people have to be notified within 60 calendar days. The FTC has to be notified if it involves more than 500 people. There's a certain amount of time, and the media has to be notified as well. And so there's more time given if there's less than 500 people. So don't think that if there's less that there are no requirements. But I want to point out that there's a very short turnaround in these requirements, and so companies need to get the data breach response plan in place if this would occur. I did want to point out that there are a couple other rules. The FTC's red flags rule applies to financial institutions and some creditors, and there's a very detailed definition of creditors on the FTC's website, and that requires a written identity theft prevention program to be written down that says, what red flags do you foresee in your business in terms of identity theft? How are you going to detect them? What actions are you going to take when you detect them? And how will you continue to keep your program current? And finally, if you are dealing with the European Union, there's a replacement to the US-EU Safe Harbor program, and it's called the Privacy Shield Network. And it provides a method for transfer of personal data to the US from the EU in a way consistent with EU law. And you must self-certify that you are in compliance with this every year if you choose to be part of this framework to the Department of Commerce. And if you do misrepresent that, this is a case where the FTC could pursue your company for the misrepresentation. So as for where to get the additional resources, So we talked about the FTC has a specific part of its website dedicated to business, and so it's business.ftc.gov, and it talks not only about cybersecurity, but it talks about, and here's a picture of it, it talks about advertising and marketing, credit and finance. There's specific industries that are even focused. If you may be one that maybe have a lot of issues with the FTC, there's endorsement guides. If you're putting testimonials on your website or making sure that you are complying with COPPA in terms of what you're marketing towards children. So there's all sorts of great guidance here. There's also, if you just want to look at data security, ftc.gov/data security, and that consolidates the data security information. Here's a picture of it here. And then finally, in addition to the FTC, there are other agencies who have really good cybersecurity information. The www.uscert.gov is the United States Computer Emergency Readiness Team, and it's part of the Department of Homeland Security. It has great information. The FBI, of course, and IC3.gov is the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, and it has PSAs, scam alerts, and other publications outlining specific scams. So hopefully that you can get a lot of what you need from these sources, but I definitely want to answer some more questions if we have any time, if we have any of those.
I'm not showing any additional questions from the audience. I guess the only thing that does pop into my mind is, Amy, when you're looking at these companies and the companies that you talk to, what do they struggle with most when it comes to data security?
I think what companies struggle with most, especially small businesses, is they're just trying to focus on their business. As one person put it to me, I'm just trying to make a hamburger, and that's what their employees are doing, and that's what their focus is, and cybersecurity slips to the wayside. And so that's why starting with it, making it a part of your everyday thinking, and having your employees review videos, because a lot of the problems occur when an employee will click on an email link, when they'll go to a website. And so educating your employees about, not going to certain websites, and, you can block websites, or you can even make sure, the personal email isn't accessed on your business devices, or lots of things just can be blocked in order to limit that. And so educating your employees and really just taking the time to think about it, because it can be really devastating to a company if a data breach occurs. It's a lot of expense, it's a lack of trust, and some companies don't recover from that. And so proactive thinking will really help prevent that, hopefully.
And last question, in 30 seconds or less, if you were to take one takeaway from your presentation, what would you want the folks who are attending today to walk away with?
That the FTC is a great resource. So if you're on the bus, in a car waiting, just sign up for a blog, because even if you hear about a certain kind of attack, you'll recognize it when it comes up. I will read about something, and within 24 hours, I'll be getting an email to my personal email that I may have fallen for had I not, and really damaged my personal computer had I not known that it was a problem. So just really keeping up to date on all the unfortunate hacking occurrences that are happening.
Great. Well, Amy, thank you so much. Appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day. And everyone, I hope this was very helpful to you. We're going to be, as we always do, sending this out in our newsletter in about a month. If you're not getting the Mind Your Business newsletter that we send, you can you can subscribe to it at cozy.org/subscribe, and then enter your email and check on the Mind Your Business button, and you'll be getting that delivered to your inbox every Thursday. Amy, thanks again. Appreciate it. And everyone, enjoy the rest of your day, and you may now all disconnect.